Słychać mnie? Tak, dobra. Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie. Nazywam się Bożena Winiarska i jestem zastępcą dyrektora Książnicy Pomorskiej, w których to progach mamy dzisiaj zaszczyt, honor gościć Państwa na ciekawym wydarzeniu, panelu dyskusyjnym pod tytułem Nowe wyzwania dla bezpieczeństwa w strefie Bałtyku w kontekście wojny w Ukrainie. Moderatorem dzisiejszego spotkania będzie pan profesor Pierre-Frédéric Weber, wicedyrektor Instytutu Historycznego Uniwersytetu Szczecińskiego. I honor powitania naszych gości już pozostawiam panu profesorowi. Jeszcze może dodam, że tłumaczenie symultaniczne w języku polskim przeprowadzi pan Jakub Skrzeczkowski. Państwu życzę wielu ciekawych wrażeń, życzę wielu ciekawych wniosków. Bardzo życzę i sobie, i Państwu, aby ta dyskusja zakończyła się mimo okoliczności optymistycznie, pozytywnie, żeby była też natchnieniem do przemyśleń na zbliżający się weekend. Panie profesorze, proszę pełnić honory i życzę Państwu wszystkiego dobrego.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję bardzo pani dyrektor za miłe słowa powitania ze strony gospodarza naszego dzisiejszego panelu, który będzie w języku angielskim, ale na początek pozwalam sobie te słowa powitania skierować do Państwa w języku polskim. Chciałbym, zanim zacznę przedstawianiem naszych gości, przekazać jeszcze słowo panu profesorowi Czapiewskiemu, który jest dyrektorem Instytutu Nauk o Politologii i Bezpieczeństwa na Uniwersytecie Szczecińskim i który ma zaszczyt przekazać Państwu słowo też powitania Jego Magnificencji rektora Uniwersytetu Szczecińskiego, profesora doktora habilitowanego Waldemara Tarczyńskiego. Panie profesorze, zapraszam.
Wzrost pozwala mi zejść ze sceny. Serdecznie Państwa witam. Cieszę się, że to da dla mnie wielki zaszczyt w imieniu Magnificencji dyrektora profesora Tarczyńskiego Państwa tutaj powitać na tym wspaniałym wydarzeniu, bo rzeczywiście kaliber gości, których udało się zgromadzić, jest wyjątkowy. Bardzo się cieszymy, że Uniwersytet Szczeciński, korzystając oczywiście z tych przyjaznych murów Książnicy Pomorskiej, może być przestrzenią do tej prowadzenia debaty naukowej również. Powiedzieć, że temat jest ważny i aktualny, to parafrazując Jerzego Pilcha, to nic nie powiedzieć. Bo rzeczywiście zarazem też ten temat jest bardzo lokalny i zarazem globalny, bo dotyczy tematów, których zakres we współczesnej międzynarodowej sytuacji jest ogromny. Dla mnie to też ogromna przyjemność być tutaj w tym miejscu i widzieć ten skład z wielu powodów, ponieważ obecność i jednostki NATO w naszym mieście jest ważna, a Uniwersytet Szczeciński również docenia tę obecność. Przygotowujemy się również do wydarzeń w kontekście 20-lecia członkostwa Polski w NATO. A ja już personalnie mam taką podwójną radość, ponieważ gdzieś lubię o sobie mówić, że jestem brytofilem. Nawet kiedyś w przeszłości mówiłem, że jestem blerystą, aczkolwiek po 20 latach to już jest zdecydowanie mniej modne niż w przeszłości. Ale bardzo cieszę się, że będę mógł słuchaczem tej dyskusji. Może to jest wcześnie na gratulacje, ale widząc ten skład pozwolę sobie trochę uprzedzić i pogratulować organizatorom tak wspaniałego składu i tego wydarzenia. Już mówiłem wcześniej, że do perfekcji brakuje tylko jednej rzeczy, bo jest ten mała kolizja czasowa z tym piłkarskim wydarzeniem o godzinie 18:00. Ale poza tym jest wszystko na najwyższym poziomie i na pewno dyskusje, i wątki czy wnioski, które się z tej dyskusji narodzą, będą bardzo, bardzo interesujące. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo panu profesorowi. Chciałbym też dodać, że zapowiadały się osoby zainteresowane i ważne w naszym środowisku i też w regionie, które niestety ze względu na inne obowiązki musiały jednak zrezygnować z udziału w tym naszym tutejszym, dzisiejszym spotkaniu, a bynajmniej nie ze względu na mecz jakikolwiek, bo miał być na przykład pan wojewoda, pan Adam Rudawski, ale ważne spotkanie, którego dopiero się dowiedział dzisiaj przed 12 uniemożliwia jego obecność wśród nas. I też osoby bardzo zainteresowane i też ze względów oczywistych chciałyby być obecne z Korpusu Konsularnego Szczecińskiego, ale tu kolizja dotyczy różne spotkania, które organizują poszczególne centrale, czyli ambasady, i na które zaproszone są osoby, które piastują te funkcje konsuli honorowych. To dotyczy zarówno konsula honorowego Zjednoczonego Królestwa w Szczecinie, pana Ryszarda Kargera, jak i również dziekana Korpusu Konsularnego Szczecińskiego, pana mecenasa Andrzeja Prejsa, który jest konsulem honorowym Danii. Ale poprosili mnie, żebym jednak podkreślił w obecności naszych gości, że bardzo się cieszą tego wydarzenia i że to się wydarzy właśnie w Szczecinie, więc pragnę też te słowa przekazać Państwa obecności i skierować je do naszych panelistów, szczególnie z zagranicy, ale nie tylko. Szanowni Państwo, przedstawiam krótko naszych uczestniczących, po czym przejdziemy po angielsku do meritum naszej dyskusji. Po dyskusji będzie możliwość zadawania pytań, czy to po polsku, czy po angielsku, co kto woli. Mamy zapewnione profesjonalne tłumaczenie w obie strony, więc jest możliwość skorzystania też z słuchawek. Nie ma problemu. Po pierwsze, przedstawiam pana profesora Brendana Simmsa, który jest historykiem, dobrze znanym poza też Wielką Brytanią. Może Państwo mieli okazję spostrzec choćby w księgarniach, nie chcę wymienić znanej sieci, żeby tutaj nie zrobić podprogowej czy nawet ponadprogowej reklamy, ale polskiej sieci księgarni, gdzie można znaleźć polskie tłumaczenia niektórych książek historycznych pana profesora. Między innymi wydał książkę pod tytułem Europe, the Struggle for Supremacy, 1453 to the Present Day w roku 2013 albo w roku 2016 Britain's Europe, a Thousand Years of Conflict and Cooperation. Żeby tylko tutaj przytoczyć te dwie publikacje wśród licznych innych, interesuje się szczególnie w ostatnich latach kwestią nowego ładu w Europie i integracji europejskiej po Brexicie. Drugim gościem jest tutaj pan Charles Clarke, który, i tu wymieniam ostatni etap jego politycznej kariery, ale były wcześniejsze inne etapy, był w rządzie brytyjskiego premiera Tony'ego Blaira w latach 2004-2006 ministrem spraw wewnętrznych, czyli Home Secretary, ale miał też ważne funkcje w Ministerstwie Edukacji pod koniec lat 90. Przyczynił się do też ważnej reformy edukacji szkolnictwa wyższego w Wielkiej Brytanii i generalnie jest mocno związany z światem akademickim, szczególnie od momentu, gdy zakończył raczej swoją karierę ściśle polityczną. Jest obecnie profesorem wizytującym na Uniwersytecie w Lancaster oraz w King's College w Londynie. Warto wymienić, że w 2011 roku Center for European Reform wydało jego monografię pod tytułem The European Union and Migration, a Call for Action. Jego najnowsza publikacja pod redakcją z roku minionego nosi tytuł Understanding the Baltic States, więc pan minister zna się na temat bałtycki i przede wszystkim też nosi te kompetencje w centrum, w ośrodku, którego dyrektorem jest pan profesor Simms, a w którym też aktywny jest pan minister jako Joint Program Leader, czyli odpowiedzialny za program bałtycki w Center for Geopolitics, czyli Ośrodku Badań Geopolitycznych przy Uniwersytecie w Cambridge. Przedstawiam też i bardzo się cieszę, że mamy właśnie taką możliwość, żeby gościć członka bardzo dobrze zorientowanym, z imponującym dorobkiem, nie tylko jako wojskowy, ale też jako badacz z korpusu NATO, no, po pierwsze z sił zbrojnych polskich, ale obecnie w korpusie natowskim Międzynarodowego Korpusu Północno-Wschodniego w Szczecinie, pana pułkownika Macieja Zaborowskiego. Pan pułkownik jest oficerem Sił Powietrznych Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej. Służył m.in. w NATO w Supreme Allied Command Transformation w Norfolk, Virginia w latach 2008-2011. W misji obserwacyjnej Unii Europejskiej w Gruzji na przełomie roku 2013-2014 oraz przez dobre 4 lata między 2017 a 2021 w US Central Command w Tampa, w Florydzie, w Stanach Zjednoczonych, gdzie jego główny obszar analizy dotyczył rywalizacji wielkich mocarstw ze szczególnym uwzględnieniem Rosji, Chin, Azji Środkowej i Bliskiego Wschodu. Obecny jest asystentem szefa sztabu do spraw polityki, planowania i oceny w dowództwie Wielonarodowego Korpusu Północno-Wschodniego NATO w Szczecinie. Last but not least pragnę przedstawić mojego kolegę z Instytutu Historycznego, pana profesora doktora habilitowanego Jörga Hackmanna, wieloletniego pracownika Instytutu Historycznego w Szczecinie, który też jest dyrektorem Międzynarodowego Ośrodka Badań Interdyscyplinarnych Uniwersytetu Szczecińskiego w Kulicach i od 1 lipca będzie miał na 2-letnią kadencję ważną funkcję prezydenta Stowarzyszenia do Spraw Badań Bałtyckich, to jest Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, więc na kadencję 2024-2026. Jego zainteresowania naukowe między innymi, ale nie tylko, dotyczą właśnie historii Bałtyku i krajów bałtyckich. Moje nazwisko Pierre-Frédéric Weber, jestem również historykiem, obecnie wicedyrektorem Instytutu Historycznego Uniwersytetu Szczecińskiego. Zajmuję się historią najnowszą stosunków międzynarodowych, między innymi, ale nie tylko Europy i Środkowo-Wschodniej i będę miał przede wszystkim przyjemność i zaszczyt moderować tą debatę, tą dyskusję panelową. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo i przechodzimy do meritum. Ladies and gentlemen, we meet today in order to discuss security issues, but security issues in a very large context. It's, of course, a question of military security, but not only. We have several other aspects, political, economical aspects, questions concerning migration, which in return have effects on security problems or security challenges. And the area of interest for today is the Baltic Sea region. The Baltic Sea region that has become nowadays, well, because of the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine, more than ever, or at least more than ever since the end of the Cold War, a geopolitically strategic region, especially in the old-new confrontation we observe between, let's say, the West and not the rest, but Russia, especially, or through Russia, illiberal great powers that are also on Russia's side. As we are, not plenty of, but at least 3 or even 4 historians here, I would like to start, before discussing new challenges, I would like to start with a historical perspective on the Baltic Sea region. And my question would be to Professor Sims and also to Professor Hackmann, maybe, from the historical perspective, and especially since modern times, which particular natural, economical, and political factors have influenced security issues in the Baltic Sea region? I say also natural because we speak about geopolitics. Geopolitics is about geo, so also earth and natural aspects.
Can you all hear me? Splendid. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, first of all, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here in this great city. But to answer your question, Pierre-Frédéric, I think that if we look at the modern history of the Baltic, if we take it really from the 1700 or so onwards, I would say a very important factor is the resource factor. And we tend to think nowadays of the resource issue as being an energy issue, energy supply via Nord Stream and other vehicles, which we'll talk about later. But actually in the 18th century, if you were talking about resources in the Baltic, you would have talked about naval stores, the supply of masts, the supply of hemp, all the things that go into making a warship came through the Baltic. So for Britain, for example, control of the Baltic, or at least the free flow of resources through the Baltic, was an absolute vital interest. So that's one example of a strategic interest. And the other examples of a strategic interest is the question of balance against hegemony. And this is something we see all the way through the last 200 years. You've got, on the one hand, forces like Sweden, for example, which at least up until the early 18th century was seeking to dominate the Baltic Sea region. You have the German Reich, you've got Bolshevism, you've got Nazism. After that, of course, you've got the Soviet Union. And then you've got the countervailing forces of those countries which are trying to prevent a single power from gaining control over the region. So I think these would be a few of the factors that have endured over time historically. But I don't know what Jörg thinks.
Yeah, actually, thank you very much, Brendan, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I also wanted to start with balance or hegemony. And let's say the classical historical book in Germany comes from 1948 by Ludwig de Hio with the same title, and actually as an outcome of the experience of World War II. So with the attempt to establish a German hegemony, what of course failed, as all of you know. And then so he developed, so the, let's say, competing concepts as, let's say, a structural element of modern European history. And we could say that this is still going on, or has been revived in particular after the Russian full-scale aggression against Ukraine. And we just coming from a Baltic Studies conference in Yale, where we had the former Latvian president, Egil Levits, giving a talk, and he once again underlined from a perspective of a small state how important, let's say, the issue of balancing and somehow competing with conceptions of hegemony in the Baltic Sea region is. If we do it in a historical way or perspective, as we were asked, so then we of course have the classical wording notion of Dominium Maris Baltici, which probably all of you have come across with, which actually was a Swedish claim to control the Baltic, but it was also used as a counter argument against such claims that one power wanted to have the dominium, so that the others were competing such claims. And in a natural perspective or geopolitical, so the main issue was the access to the Baltic via the Öresund. So this, and as when Denmark introduced sound dues, so collecting money, so this was definitely an important geopolitical situation, which then the other states in the Baltic wanted to compete, first the Swedes, but then we have it as a general, let's say, pattern of early modern history. And then we have with the, let's say, the Swedish claims for dominion, and then disappeared in the 18th century with a new actor then coming up, which was Russia under Peter the Great. And if you look at Peter's politics, not only founding a new capital, at the shore of the Baltic, but also with the idea of getting control over Schleswig-Holstein, which then would be the other side of the Baltic, close to Denmark and the Sound. So this was clear attempt from the Russian perspective to establish an own hegemony of the Baltic Sea region. And as this did not work out, then we have the arguments by Catherine II, born here in Szczecin, who then supported the idea of a tranquillité du Nord, so the calm of the North, so meaning having balancing all the other powers, so in order as a new security concept, but of course with the idea of then at a given moment establishing so Russian control. So maybe this is very briefly about the historical perspective on security problems in the Baltic Sea region before the 20th century.
Even though not being a historian by degree, but being a history freak, as people call me, I would actually put a little bit of unrest in this because, yeah, Baltic has been since a long while the object of or objective of regional local powers. Whatever attempts, even before Sweden, there was a Danish, for instance, rule up to Estonia, North Estonia, but there was actually there had been quite successful, starting from 1350s all the way to 18th century, attempt to deny the hegemony of one state in Baltic, and that was the Hanseatic League, and Szczecin was also part of it. And that was quite successful setup, even though under German, let's say, primacy, but still, it was not a national setup. It used to be a more trade, a free flow of whatever resources based setup that quite effectively for more than 200 years denied any imperial or hegemonic attempts to be brought to Baltic Sea. And the Hanseatic League, we are talking everything from even a part of away from Baltic Sea, starting from like Netherlands, Denmark, all the way to Estonia.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned the term hegemony, which of course is not necessarily a question of hard powers, and also be read as a form of soft power hegemony through economy, or which was basically the idea of the Hanseatic cities and ports. But if we want, of course, not being anachronistic because it's of another time, another period of time, but if we want to take this concept of Mare Nostrum that was coined in Roman times, but through these attempts, we heard the term attempts to dominate, attempts to, did at any moment any of those players come somehow close to building a sort of Mare Nostrum area in the Baltic Sea region? And if yes, to what extent? Was it more economically, or was it to the extent of what we could have observed in ancient times, a total domination, a cultural domination, and so on?
I don't know what the rest of the panel think. I think probably the only power that came close would have been Sweden in the 17th century, because Swedish conception is of defending Sweden by controlling the territory on the other side. So in Germany, for instance, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern particularly, and then you've got or Anterior-Pomerania anyway, and then of course the Baltic provinces, which they lost in the 18th century to Russia. I think one can talk of a certain Swedish hegemony then. Afterwards, I think one would struggle to see any single power as being dominant. The Russians, as Professor Hackmann said, certainly attempted that under Peter the Great, but never really succeeded, not least because the Royal Navy was present on multiple occasions throughout the 18th century, frequently sent squadrons into the Baltic and basically made life difficult for the Russians. In the First World War, not very much happened. And then, of course, I suppose in the Second World War, Germany dominated several sides of the Baltic for a long period, but of course Sweden was neutral. So I guess it's a space which I would say has defied hegemony for a long time, but I don't know what others think.
Is it perhaps just worth remarking that people have... Can you hear me all right? No, that's it. Thank you, Brendan. I always rely on Brendan for everything. People have described the Baltic since the decisions of Finland and Sweden to join NATO as a NATO lake. And that is an argument that's made. I think it's a rather foolhardy argument, actually. But in the context of this discussion that we're having now, you could say that now, today, is the time when you're nearest one particular hegemony over all of this time. I wouldn't describe that as an accurate history, and it understates a series of very important both economic and political factors. And that's one of the reasons we want to try and do our best to understand this better. I also think here in this city, the impact of migration immediately after 1945, 1944-5, is so apparent, with whole populations switching across the southern coast of the Baltic. And the question of where state power lay relative to where people, what people were here and how they operated. You just go around this city and look at the architecture of the city, and you can see in a very dramatic way how populations have moved in different ways. And I think I'd like to say, Pierre-Frédéric, that I think we're, though it appears that we're in a position of stability with a new settled position, whether you call it a Mare Nostrum or not, I don't think it is that. I think it's a very fast-moving situation now, with different things flowing through in different ways. And really, the period from 1945 to 1990, and then 1990 until today, are marked by enormous change around the Baltic, in social systems, in what people are actually living here, in what security arrangements exist in place. And I would not regard it as a settled point. But going back to your initial introduction, I do think we're now at a point right today where there's more of a single control of the whole of the Baltic Sea than there has been at the other points in the past, which people have described.
Okay. Yeah. I think so. One has to define what is meant with Mare Nostrum. Of course, you could do, let's say, find discourses of national or imperial hegemony throughout, at least from the 19th century. So the Germans were convinced that, of course, with regard to Hansa, that the Baltic was always a Germanic sea, and all the other peoples, cultures were not really relevant to it, and in particular not the Slavic ones. So this is, of course, something we have left behind. We also left behind another discourse of a Mare Nostrum, which was the Soviet socialist idea of the Baltic as a sea of peace. So meaning, so a war was then coming from NATO, from the West, but so the Warsaw Pact then was guaranteeing peace, and this was something which was at least ideologically very much promoted in the 1950s, 1960s, then somewhere ending in the 1970s. So this we should have in mind when talking about these discourses. And there is also another one which is probably more acceptable and probably more we look at it with more sympathy. So this is the Nordic understanding of the, let's say, at least the Nordic region, maybe not the whole Baltic Sea region, but the Nordic region as a region of liberty and social welfare with friendly neighbors not attacking the others. So meaning we have a couple of understandings of the Baltic Sea region, how to see it, and some of them we definitely with the idea of violence and war, and at least one rather looking at it from a perspective of neighbors living in peace.
Yeah. As much as I would agree that currently we have the setup which basically allows the largest span of single faction, let's call it this way, spanning control over the Baltic Sea. I have it hard to consider NATO as one in this case, because NATO composes of so many different entities with diverse, not, I wouldn't say values, but diverse national, let's say, or short-term, mid-term objectives. That as much as NATO unites us, and that's why looking at Baltic Sea as an internal NATO pond really makes sense, even from the strategic perspective. And we could actually say that we try to do something what Russia is trying to do the Azov and Black Sea on the other way. Then I still would have it hard to say that it's like a single power dominating Baltic Sea. I would rather call it a single set of values instead of a single power. And I would fully subscribe to several points already mentioned, like for instance the 1617 when Peter the Great decided to move the capital to St. Petersburg and actually build a city and pivot future and history of Russia towards the west instead of east. And this is actually the historical moment when Russia for the first time started looking at Baltic Sea as the way and means also to expand. But I would then argue about Russian capabilities for the maritime domain. They never had a culture of maritime fight. And then it was actually quite easy for Royal Navy, like battle hardened on the oceans and seas to defeat Russian navies. I could maybe name only 2 Russian admirals having some successes during Crimean Wars, and that's it. Any other maritime engagement, Russia has always been losing, no matter which point on the map we look at. So therefore, I would not be so much concerned about the Russian. Maybe they might have appetites, even if we look at the period 1944-45. They were only able to launch some submarine operations to sink German ships trying to rescue people from East Prussia, and they basically never were able to conduct any surface operations on the Baltic Sea, even when they had full air support and basically could have full control over Baltic Sea once they got permission to use Finnish Hanko Island to refuel and rearm their submarines.
Yes, of course, the term Mare Nostrum I used was supposed to be thought-provoking, but not in order to find a one-to-one comparison. But I think that what's lacking in order to find some cases of a similar Mare Nostrum in the Baltic Sea region is that it supposes a long time domination that gets integrated as something is not a domination, but is accepted as a sort of community of fate, in fact. And for sure, if you have a look at the past 2 centuries, there are no periods of time that were that long to create a sort of community feeling under the domination of a hegemonic power. So I think that might be an element of explanation. In fact, even if there were attempts to create that, but maybe besides the case of the Hansa, other attempts were basically coined on domination, on a coercion in order to have some territories subdued or to some extent for a period of time. Still, the historical sources are important. We go ahead in time, and there is this turning point. Well, is it 1991, or should we start in 1989, or the period 1989, 1990, 1991? So the end of Cold War, or maybe should we say of one stage of a Cold War? What were the turning points from today's perspective, and trying to address it as historians, or having a historiographical look on this newest history in the past 30 years in the Baltic Sea region, that you consider as being important in shaping also maybe, there is not a past dependency, but some of the problems we have today, and to what extent maybe some narratives on the sea, on Europe, on the end of Cold War, happened to feed resentments, or let's say maybe misunderstandings that could have led to a situation we're observing and to security challenges we're facing nowadays in the region. Who wants to start? It's up to you, Jules.
I'm not doing very well at getting my microphone right. My esteemed professor, his technical skills are renowned. It's helping me. Thank you very much indeed. For me, the key word is George's, which is liberty. He said in his answer earlier on. What has happened in these last years has been the assertion of the peoples around the Baltic Sea, particularly the southern part of the Baltic Sea, that they want to determine their own futures, and they're not prepared to accept a domination that comes from above in some way. And that's certainly been true here in Poland, it's been true of the Baltic states and so on. If I think of my wife's family in Estonia, the domination of the Baltic Germans at that time kept all the Estonians completely out. But there's gradually the assertion, and I think this is the key thing of this phase, that people have got the right to determine their own destinies. And going back to the discussion we had a second ago about NATO, I think this is the core point which Putin does not understand. The point about NATO is, despite the fact it is a command structure which works as a command structure, it is different countries coming to different agreements about how they should protect their own liberty. It's not an American construct or any particular type of European construct saying this is how you have to do it. This is countries coming together. So it's the free will of Sweden and Finland that they've decided to join this military arrangement. It wasn't something that was required of them by somebody else. It was because they wanted to be able to defend themselves more effectively in the current environment from a perceived antagonist. And I think, Pierre-Frédéric, you've put the question in the right way, because this evolution towards the idea that the governance, the governmental institutions, the military defense and so on are responsive to the people who live here, rather than being imposed by an outside dictator of some kind, or even less than a dictator, an outside autocratic power, I think is absolutely fundamental. And of course, on the other side of the Baltic, for the reasons that were said earlier, the countries around there, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and so on, have also been well known for trying to develop relatively liberal welfare states and so on in this time. And I think that gives it's not surprising that on many world rankings of place to live and so on, and what are the values, cities and countries around the Baltic Sea come right near the top of the desired attributes of how people want to live. And I think that's an immense, enormous change over the time you've described. And I'd certainly say 89, 1990, 1991 was an absolutely decisive moment in that, because it said that the Soviets couldn't run it as they wanted. The people of the countries concerned had to decide what they wanted to do. And that's what's happening, and that's what NATO is trying to do now.
Yes, I completely agree with Charles that the period 1989-91 is an obvious turning point, and it's really when you have clarity that there will not be the use of Soviet military power to keep the Eastern Bloc in general, but of course in particular for our purposes the Baltic Sea region within the Soviet Empire. I think the next turning point is the decision in the mid to late 1990s to enlarge NATO, because that then gives this part of the world, and of course the Baltic states, the security guarantee which it previously never had. The subsequent turning point is, of course, the shift within Russian politics, which really becomes visible with Vladimir Putin's notorious speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he says, he signals basically that Russia is going to return to great power politics. 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, is not a turning point, unfortunately, in much of the European perception of the problem, but it is very much registered here and in the Baltic states and also in Scandinavia as a fundamental breach of the European order. And it's really only in 2022, of course, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that really that lesson is learned more generally. So those would seem to me to be the turning points, which I think were very visible to people here in the region long before they were obvious to the rest of us in Europe.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, of course. So identifying turning points is that what historians love to do, and I think Brendan has and Charles have already mentioned all the important things. Just to underline it with some focus on the Baltic Sea region. So when did it start? So I would say probably 1970. So with the uprisings at the Polish coastal cities of Szczecin, Gdynia, Gdańsk, as a first step towards Solidarność and the, let's say, liberation of the Polish society from Soviet socialist rule. So this is one thing. So then we are really quite back in history. So 50 years perspective. A little bit smaller, so not that relevant, but for the time when it happened, quite relevant was the retreat of the Soviet army, or then Russian army, from the then territories which belonged before to the Warsaw Treaty Organization, so meaning from East Germany, from Poland, and definitely from the Baltic states. And this actually was a quite long process, which I think ended only in 1995. Only then, actually, NATO expansion was then something realistic. And 2007, I would underline with another thing, also related to Russia. So the so-called Bronze Soldier incident in Tallinn, which probably all of you have heard. So the removal, or let's say transposal, one might say, of a Soviet war monument from the center of the Estonian capital of Tallinn to a soldiers' cemetery, which happened actually in 2007, and then was accompanied by the first cyber attack, obviously from Russia on NATO country, on Estonia. So from this period onwards, we do have the conflict, and we do see Russia on a course of conflict towards NATO.
Yeah, so yeah, we already heard a pretty great selection of societal, political reasons why we should look at certain events or certain time periods in the most recent history, let's say those 3 decades. I could only subscribe to it. And sometimes I like to apply kind of reverse technology and look from now back. So definitely the most recent events, Sweden, Finland joining NATO, that really game changer for the Baltic, and including the Baltic states. Just to not repeat what has already been mentioned, but I would also include here Putin's pivot towards the east. That is like the first, I recall in history, case when the Russian ruler decided to look not west, but east for the future of Russia. And this so-called marriage of convenience between Russia and China that we currently, since like a couple of years, observe, that brings quite significant potential, maybe not so recognized yet in our area, but I actually started my PhD with the topic on the relevance and the meaning and the role of Poland and Central Eastern Europe in the current and the future great powers competition. So I think there is a huge potential, and a lot of things may still to come. Then I would also definitely point out the flow of Western European investments in the Baltic states. Now, that of course was possible because Soviet Union was no more, and the 3 Baltic states got their independence. Without the independence, that would not be possible. But what the countries benefit, I think, the most from is actually those direct investments and direct ties with the Western countries. For instance, like the Danish investments in Latvia, or the Nordic countries invest in Sweden, Finland investing in Estonia. For obvious reason, historical, societal ties, whatever. And maybe one more than I'd like to add. Thing that is still with a potential to be seen, and a lot of people don't want to remember, or maybe don't know it, but shortly after Soviet Union collapse, we can talk about it later on. I disagree with the statement that Soviet Union collapsed. I see it like a peaceful transformation into something else that was well prepared and well executed. But anyways, so after Soviet Union was no more, very shortly after the 3 states, Baltic states, got their independence, Kremlin immediately started criticizing and objecting to the layout of borders. And there are even some examples, like I know that Rand Corporation back in 2015-14 maybe prepared a map also depicting Russian ambitions or demands against the borders, today's borders of the Baltic Sea. And I only could recommend to look at it. It's like, Latvia being split in two, Latgalia and whatever left in the western Kurland pocket, Lithuania without access to Baltic Sea, of course, direct land connection to Kaliningrad Oblast, and also Estonia losing most of the northern coastline. So this is, I think, something to still evolve and to be seen, because if we, for instance, from the military side, consider whatever possible actions from the Russia, I would always encourage to look at such things, because one thing that we know from Moscow is that, ironically, they tell a lot of truth, things that are to happen, actually. They, of course, mix it with information, through the information chaos, with some made-up stories, whatever, but most of the things that we could observe over the last 2 decades or so that Russia actually did, that was announced ahead of time. It was like kind of promised to the world that Putin will do it, and he did it. We simply did not see the things coming. So I think apart from the things that they were pivotal to the Baltic states, there are some things that already happened in the past, but have connection to the future as well.
One thing the the Kremlin has been quite good at is also post-rationalizing his behavior in terms of sometimes rewriting newest history. There is this well-known stance that is being also repeated by some opinion makers in the West, that by the end of the Cold War, supposedly the West had made the promise not to extend NATO to the east. There was nothing like that, nothing like this. It can be found in any archive, and what counts is the written word, we could say. And also that this extension of NATO eastwards was supposed to be aggressive. Well, of course, we know that NATO tried to integrate also to have discussions with Russia. There was also a NATO office in Moscow, that was then closed because the Russians didn't want that anymore.
And the Russian officers present in NATO headquarters.
Yeah. And so this kind of post-rationalizing of a behavior that was in fact not justified as such by the facts, is something that we have got used to in the Russian narrative in Putin's years, especially, which finds quite some appetence also in some circles in the West. But you mentioned China, can we say that, or would you consider that China to some extent starts or has already started and becomes more and more a player to some extent, or a factor of risk and security in the Baltic Sea region through Russia, or even directly, if we consider, for example, questions like economy, energy. We have this, the Green Deal, trying to go more and more electric. As we know, China has the largest amount of rare earths, but a couple of days ago came the information that Norway has found a huge amount of rare earths in its area of sovereignty, so it could be a game changer. You can imagine that this is not something that is not of interest for Chinese. So how do you see that? Is China still far away, or is China already a player in the Baltic Sea region?
I think I'll let others speak to some of the broader economic questions and also some military ones, but I think China has already played an important role. If you think, for example, about the dispute between Lithuania and China over the question of the Taiwan representative office, where there was an economic boycott, effectively, by China. So China is already pushing its position in the Baltic states and is an actor. It has also conducted some joint naval exercises in the region. And of course, it has its Belt and Road infrastructure policy, which involves railroads ultimately ending up in Poland and other places. And lastly, of course, with the melting of the ice in the high north, you have the opening up of the Northern Sea route, which of course then ultimately via canals and so on can come through the Baltic. So actually, from that point of view, the world has shrunk, and the distance between the Baltic Sea region and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, is now much, much less that distance than we would have thought even 10 years ago.
Well, I could say on one hand, like, we have some bad news in this regard, because from the Chinese perspective, they most likely see Baltic Sea as like an internal little pond, just, a small obstacle on the way to get to the Norway, like the Nordic countries. Their perspective is beyond our normal understanding and imagination. Belt and Road Initiative is only a fraction of something that Xi Jinping announced, I believe it was 2013 in Astana, as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So Belt and Road is just one of the aspects of this great rejuvenation. And for a reason, even the semantics they use, like they talk Silk Road, because they know that silk is one of those very pricey, precious words for the Western Hemisphere. So all the language, the semantics, the words they use, even to be like more acceptable or more encouraging or inviting for us. I think we are still to see the results of Chinese going across Asia towards our region. I wouldn't say that it's with Russia. I would rather say it's with a little help of Russia, because what we see, both Russia, China, these are the old, definitely China, even older group of values, I would say it this way, that do not accept alliances and partners. From the Chinese and Russian perspective alike, the one who needs allies, who needs partners, presents the weakness, that you cannot do things on your own. So from the Chinese and Russian perspective, in order to be a real power, you have to be able to do things on your own without being dependent on anybody else. And now, if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, that was actually one of my important topics for more than 4 years. If you put it on a map, there is one depiction of idea of Belt and Road Initiative where all the world is basically labeled except 2 places, and those 2 white spots are US and India. Those are to be bypassed. But in order to understand Belt and Road and this great rejuvenation and Chinese ambitions for Europe, I would look at the objectives, the end states, and those end states meet together somewhere in Belgium, Netherlands, northwestern Germany. But in order to get there, those tentacles need to go through Central Eastern Europe, also Balkans. This is where they start gathering. So definitely, they will have interests to spread their influence in our region, and definitely they will be more than happy to enjoy the resources. Maybe not so much now, because we know that European resources are too expensive for them usually, especially Norwegian ones. They are looking for much cheaper stuff. So definitely, I would say, depending of course on the internal dynamics in China, but we will see China here very soon, even more and more.
We have started talking about also some extent about energy supplies. Well, we all remember that with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, basically years of change through business policy provided, especially, but not only, but especially by the German governments toward Russia since, I would say, the end of the Cold War, at least the early 2000s, came abruptly to an end, or at least their legitimacy or their efficiency was proven to be non-existent. And you all remember the famous word, a German word that became an international word then, that was coined by Chancellor Olaf Scholz about the Zeitenwende, so the change of an era, you know. In fact, of course, Germany started doing much in a short time in order to transform their energy supplies, which was not easy for such a huge economy. Basically, these kind of changes are easier for countries like Estonia than for an economy like Germany. But still, the first the first visible changes happened quite quickly. But still, it happens. It seems to be difficult for Germany, but also other major economies in Europe, to get somehow out of the energy trap, let's say, or the trap of energy supplies. I would, well, maybe put an accent on it and called it the Gazprom complex. Yeah, are we really about to get out of that problem? Have we really started getting rid of this source of risk? And are we able to totally resign, and in what a period of time, from this kind of interdependence in terms of energy, with all the implications that are present as far as geopolitics are concerned. Just in addition, I remember, not for having seen it myself in the times when it was drawn, because I was too small, but later on it was a drawing from Chicago Sun, I think, in 1982, where you have President François Mitterrand, the French president in the early 80s, and the German chancellor, that look into a pipe, you know? And the pipe goes on and ends, in fact, as a Soviet tank. Yeah? And it's the end of the tank. Yeah? And with this text, well, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah?
This is a very interesting question. Our centre in Cambridge has had 2 or 3 events in different countries looking at energy security in the Baltic and these issues, with very interesting contributions. I think there's firstly, just to respond to your last point, Pierre-Frédéric, a very interesting debate in historical terms about why so many people were blinded about the dangers of being dependent on Russia for energy in so many different areas. One thinks of Angela Merkel in particular, of course, but also the whole of the German political establishment and industrial establishment, and most of Western Europe was in this category as well. But let's put that to one side. I would say there has been significant movement in the last year and a half, 2 years, and I think it's in 2 or 3 directions. Dimension 1 is a steady increase in the proportion of our energy which is generated from renewable sources generally. And in the long term, that has to be the only way to move forward in many of these areas. There's an interesting debate about nuclear power in that context, and I would contrast France and Germany in particular on their 2 completely different approaches to nuclear power, which is then a very interesting issue. That's really a discussion more than anything about nuclear, the safety of nuclear power and people's fears about it. I would say the question of the use of nuclear power has not been resolved, but I do think across the whole of the Baltic Sea region, there is a strong drive by all of the countries towards renewable energy in its other various manifestations. And even in the UK, there's been a significant use of our energy is renewable energy. But then the second, immediately more short-term challenge is the one you've referred to. After February 2022, a very urgent drive to remove dependence on Russian energy, whether by liquefied natural gas or by other means. And Germany certainly, but also other countries, have moved surprisingly quickly, I would say, on that short-term direction. I would say it's short-term because you're removing dependence on Russia and replacing it by dependence on other sources of carbon fuel. And you need to think very carefully about what you can do. But I would say that is a trend that is moving. It's moved faster than I expected, and I would say it will accelerate. So those are the two areas where I think you've got these two strands which are moving in the different directions. But the net effect is to reduce dependence on Russia, which is the key thing at this time, and to weaken Russia's economy.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the most valid questions and topics for now, and also for the near and maybe a bit longer future, because we created something, kind of let's say machine, let's call it this way. The progress, this immense speed of development of the recent decades makes us also very energy hungry. And apparently, we do not understand completely the consequences. And the easy pick on Russia and the easy solution, just, yeah, let's get it from Russia, that really made us kind of blind, and maybe we overslept a little bit. I would encourage anybody who has a chance, go to Georgia, eastern Georgia. There is this small village called Shamgona. It used to be a place where one of the most important gas pipelines was going through from Caucasus to central Russia. When the war back in August 2008 broke out between Russia and Georgia, Russians just blew the pipe just like that, without caring about the consequences. Very close to the pipeline, you can see huge open pipe just rusting out there in the field. And very close to it, you can also find some rubble and leftovers of one of the most important railway bridges, also connecting Caucasus to central Russia. Again, blown up by Russians just like that, without any thought. So I would just argue that we simply do not understand what it really means to make deals with Russia. Because as much as we put a lot of value to trust, to common values, common interests, and things like that, most of those things are either irrelevant for Russians, or demonstration of weakness, or an opportunity to affect or to bring some hard time on the other side. So I will fully subscribe to whatever statement pushing or putting attention on us really thinking how to get independent from the entities which we do not understand. And also another issue is, like, apparently those self-renewable resources, they are not so sustainable. They are very fragile from military perspective, one of the easiest targets, one of the easiest picks, and also bringing a lot of harm. So one of the first targets from the military perspective. Just investing in those renewables resources or sources of energy, when we still do not understand how to make them really work for our benefit, for our best, is a very tricky game. And I would even call it maybe not so wise game.
Yeah, just in addition, so on the Zeitenwende, so actually what finally led to the change in Germany was the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, so which then ended all debates whether to continue the cooperation with Russia and continue to get gas supplies from there. And actually, so if you look at the debates in Germany, it was very much and some are still convinced that some was some kind of a peace project. So that this was Wandel durch Annäherung, so coming together through trade and common economic interest. And obviously this, as you fully rightly said, so was not the interest in Russia anymore. And actually, so understanding this in Germany still takes some time. And if we even look at the new decisions about sanctions, I think there are still some exemptions for Russia made, or where the German government did not agree with the other European states. So it's very hard to get away from these decades of cooperating with Russia and the idea of creating a common security, which all the time, and this is, I think, what German politics did not understand, was at the odds with the nations in between. We definitely saw the dangers and saw that this were, from the Russian perspective, geopolitical projects, and not only economic ones.
I may add also, from the Western Hemisphere, or even if we look at the NATO, as the single most successful political military setup in mankind history so far. There is only one entity actually within the Western Hemisphere which can survive the long-term attrition conflict with Russia, and that is US, because of the size of the country and the availability, access to resources. Russian leadership knows this since a long while, that if it comes to war by attrition, like long-term scenario, no European country or no European entity can win a clash with Russia. Because in the end, even if we put sanctions on them, we stop all the pipelines, everything, they still have the resources. What do we have? I could only maybe paraphrase what one of the Chinese deputy foreign ministers said a couple of years ago. When we come to a conflict, it was when Trump put some sanctions on China. We, people of the East, can survive eating grass. What can the Western people survive?
Yes, and this problem of being dependent came closer to our mind after this Russian issue in the context also of China and Taiwan, because as far as microprocessors or other very important electronic devices and core elements of electronic devices are concerned, most of the production is secured by one huge plant on Taiwan, which means that if China gets hold on Taiwan, we are again dependent. Well, it's not fossil energy, but it's also a very important part of what we need for our developed economies. So it's a sort of double bind from our perspective with regard to illiberal or more than illiberal regimes with regard to these questions. You mentioned, Charles, this, well, not conflict, but this radically different views on nuclear energy in France and in Germany. Well, basically France and Germany to some extent are a little bit fighting for Poland's soul with regards to that. And it seems like the nuclear option is being considered in Poland, but not necessarily for the first time with French technology, rather with American technology, Westinghouse. But we'll say. There is one point I would like to address as a security issue to end our panel, and then give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions or join the discussion. It's the question of borders and migrations, because in fact we have got used in the past few years that there is pretty much nothing that Russia would not weaponize in order to provide a policy of divide et impera in Europe and within the European Union. And one of the weaponized issue, especially in the past few months again with high relevance, is the question of migrations. Yeah, we see it. Sorry, we see it in the border region between Belarus and Poland, and on Belarus and Lithuania, especially in an area that is, in general, strategically very important, with this Suwałki passage, which is the weak point of NATO to some extent. But well, are we prepared? When I say we, NATO, European Union, so both on the military level and on the, let's say, political level, Are we prepared to handle migrations as an element of hybrid warfare, as it is, actually applied by states like Russia and Belarus?
I would say certainly the EU, European Union, I cannot speak for NATO, is not prepared to deal with the migration issue properly. The pamphlet that I wrote in 2011, which was about migration in the EU, and when I was writing it, I came to Warsaw, I came here to Poland to talk to the Polish government about it, and also to the EU agency for the borders, which is called Frontex, which happens to be based in Warsaw. And it's a totally pathetic thing. There is absolutely no effort to really govern migration properly. My own view, and it's been for a long time, is that the core political issue is not migration itself, but bad governance of migration. There are some people who are totally hostile to migrants, but I don't believe that's many people. I believe people get very unnerved if they feel governments are not controlling who is coming to the country or not. When I was Home Secretary in Britain, a police officer was shot dead by a migrant who was not entitled to be in the country. And of course, everybody says, what were they doing here? What was the reason? How could they be doing it? And the question of the governance of migration is the key question. But the EU has not yet been able to deal with the governance of migration in an effective way. The key element in the governance of migration is the ability to return people who've come to your country that are found not to be there legally to the country from which they came. If you can't do that, then you can't solve the problem. So to take the Belarus-Lithuania problem, if people get into the country from Belarus to Lithuania, and it's worth observing that they're not mainly people from Belarus, they're people who are coming from countries right around the world, from Afghanistan, Syria and so on, who are being moved, and as you rightly said in your question, being weaponized by the Belarus government supported by the Russians. If you can't return them from that, then the issue is there. We've seen the failure to address this and the growth of the nationalist right across Europe in many different circumstances. And I believe that the EU governments have to really get hold of this. This is not a particular point about Poland, because I think the Polish government has been reasonably effective compared to some other governments. But Germany, France, UK have not really been able to do it in the way that's necessary. So the answer is to establish a system of governing migration, including the ability to return people to the country from which they came if they're not here legally. What you can't do is pretend migration is not going to exist, that we'll be in a world of no migration. The economic forces behind migration, the humanitarian forces behind migration are always going to be very strong. And most people's instincts are to be humanitarian. That is to say, if somebody is living in tyranny, to say we should offer some kind of help to people in those circumstances. But it has to be a system which is properly managed, properly governed, properly controlled. As I say, I don't know how NATO approaches this, but as far as the EU and the UK government is concerned, I would say they don't have the means of addressing this effectively at the moment.
I have very little to add to that, and I know we're coming to audience questions in a minute. The only thing I wanted to contribute on this question was that it's not just a matter of the pressure coming from Belarus, also actually on the Russian-Finnish border, there have been manipulations by the Russians pushing essentially migrants across, and as you say, they've closed the border. But it's also a question of populations that have come for reasons that have nothing to do with Russia, but whose presence is being exploited by Russian propaganda. If you take, for example, Sweden, where you have had a huge influx from former Yugoslavia, but then more recently from the Middle East, and you've got cities like Malmö and Gothenburg, where you have a very large proportion now of immigrants. That is fueling a rise of the far right, which in turn is being exploited by Russian propaganda. So here the migration and the geopolitics are very closely connected.
Allow me to stir the pot a little bit and add maybe something a bit more provocative. So first of all, migration is nothing new to Europe. if we look at the last, let's say, 2,500 years, we are what we are because we are created by migrations, mass migrations all across Europe. And I doubt that we can find a 1 century without some significant migrations throughout history. What is new, though, is what was already mentioned, this weaponization of migration. So using peoples being moved as a kind of weapon. And then I think, for me, it's actually not so surprising. There are 2 hints. One, the book written by 2 Chinese colonels in mid-90s, Unrestricted Warfare, how they describe how to win a war against the West. So it's basically weaponization of everything. Even a tissue or a book, a glass, could be used as a weapon. If you track back how it's produced, to what purposes it serves, and on and on. So basically this was like the first. And the second hint is something that the West calls Gerasimov Doctrine, which Russians usually laugh when they hear Gerasimov Doctrine. It was just a series of articles, and it was like I would call it a Russian understanding of unrestricted warfare. And both Chinese and Russians understood that they cannot win a war against the West just head-on, a classical normal war. So they came up with ideas how to fight, how to wage war against the West under the threshold of Article 4, Article 5, which is this famous all one for all for one. And they are quite successful. Even the fact that we answer this question not actually knowing what's the solution is the answer, that they are successful. And now whether NATO is prepared or not. Well, first of all, NATO has always been a political military tool. NATO, it's mostly whatever NATO force, NATO command structure, so basically military used to settle things that are not in the favor of NATO, right, as a military tool. And the first cases when NATO was forced to deal with things that are not purely military happened actually during this so-called collapse of Soviet Union, and when NATO was deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, when we had to face the enemy, which was not the peer enemy. We were not fighting regular militaries anymore. We were fighting guerrillas. We were fighting hybrid, irregular threats. So I would say that it's already on the tables at the higher levels. I'm not here to speak for the higher levels. I'm just a humble representative of NATO force structure, so I'm not even, NATO command structure member. But this question has already been addressed on numerous occasions, and definitely NATO will include it into its policies and also, rules of engagement. All these things NATO simply needs to do it, because we know now, we already learned it in a hard way, that our enemies will use whatever means. Ideally, it is to stay below the threshold of Article 4 and Article 5. To not allow us to use our moral-based, law-based response to hostile activities. So this is something I would say normal from the Russian and Chinese perspective. And now our problem is how to solve this, how to deal with this. Because I agree, we are totally unprepared. This plan of unrestricted warfare and how to win wars against the West has been developed since long time by our enemies, and we simply have no answer yet for this.
I think it's also the point that for decades, political decision makers in the West have not wanted, at least publicly, but to some extent mentally, wanted to accept the fact that those regimes are actually unfriendly, that we have to consider this in these categories and not just partners in business, because business is just a tool as many others from their perspective.
Well, it's like I like to use some picturesque examples. So for discussions, even with my colleagues in uniform, I usually use this since when I started working for CENTCOM, and I was in charge of China and those things. So I got once asked by US 4-star general, okay, so tell me now, this Belt and Road, should we support it and benefit together with the Chinese? Should we just stay behind and watch, let them be? Or should we counter it? So my response was like, sir, I know it's not a proper way to answer a question with a question, but it actually needs one prime question. Is America okay with the fact that someone is challenging America's supremacy and promised to dethrone US, decouple US by 2049 for the 100 years of Chinese Revolution anniversary? If you are okay with this, then just go for it, enjoy. You will have a share. But then imagine a medieval feast. There is a lord sitting behind a table full of food. The food is dropping all over, and there are dogs running around the table. And the landlord just takes a goose, bites a piece, and then throws the rest to the dogs, then takes a pie piece and throws to the dogs, enjoying dogs fighting for the food. Will the dogs be hungry? I don't think so, because there is just more than enough food for the Lord and for the dogs on the table. They will always be fed. It's only a matter of competition between a Labrador, a Doberman, and a Chihuahua. Maybe US is this huge, bulldog, Poland being Chihuahua, competing for the food, for the leftovers. All the dogs will have enough food. But then I see the landlord to be the China. And all other dogs, those running around the table, as other partners. And are we okay with such setup? If someone says yes, then I say go for it.
Maybe to contest a little bit, who is we in the question? I think there's a question in my... Who is we? There's certainly a question in my mind about the extent to which the US wants to be a world power. Is it on? Yes. No, perfect. I've shown my technological incompetence throughout, and I apologize. I know you want to move on. I'll just make a very quick point. I think the interesting question for this is, does the United States want to be the world power in this situation? My own view is, since the midterm presidential elections in 2006, midterm congressional elections in 2006, the second George W. Bush term, where the people in America said they didn't like America fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, and presidents subsequently, including Obama, generally been trying to pull back and not commit US troops in those circumstances. I think there is a real question mark about the desire of the United States to be engaged in this kind of thing. I would say Donald Trump, when he was president, sent those messages in a whole variety of different ways. So I would say for Europe, it raises the question, how do we want to operate in these circumstances, given what's the state of affairs? Now, again, I'm not providing an answer to your questions, and I can see you're just a humble colonel. But this is there aren't answers, but the questions have to be debated.
Can we afford a little time for this duel?
A couple of minutes to open the discussion then. But still.
So as I say everybody else, because China, by definition, even how they call themselves, it's something above, in between God and the heaven and the earth. So they don't recognize anybody else as peers to them. So it's everybody else. Quick to this one. And when it comes to the US supremacy or hegemony, global hegemony, can we afford to let them not be the hegemon? I doubt.
Okay, so I would propose to the audience to join the discussion or to ask questions to our panelists. It's a great occasion that we have so much expertise here, and well, the microphone is at your disposal. Are there any questions or short comments, of course?
Hello, my name is Przemysław Jackowski. I want to ask a question. We are here just citizens, not historians, not military servicemen. Which threats do you see here for this region, for Szczecin, for Pomerania? Which threats are from Russia in this particular part of Baltic region?
Well, I wouldn't say I know it best, but first of all, when we talk about, excuse me, a clash between powers, and I dare to say that Russia, yes, Russia is a power. Whether we call it major power, great power, doesn't matter. Russians basically have all the attributes they consider themselves they need to have in place to be a power. And that is basically ability to influence things to happen in their favor or prevent some other things to not happen because they don't want it. So we are a bit away from Russia, from borders, and there is one really neat quote by Canadian Chod, even though Canada is really far away from here. He called the border, starting from Finland, north, all the way to the south with Russia, as the borderline of freedom. So when we talk about clash between powers, it doesn't matter where you are geographically, because you will always feel the consequences. And maybe not, it's not a good example or good comparison, but if we look at World War II, what happened to this land, or East Prussia, the tragedy of East Prussia, when Russians came in, when they started putting road signs, as soon as they crossed the border, the original border between East Prussia and the Baltic republics, you are now entering to translate from Russian, you are now entering the land of the layer of the beast. They were dehumanizing their enemy. And this is the kind of threat that we face. So no matter where you are geographically, their objective is destroy the other side, no matter which part of that side, the entire side. So if now we say that Russia might wage a war against NATO, that means NATO and as entity, entire NATO, no matter which country member of the NATO. And by the way, as we already could hear it or read it from reports over the last couple of years, Russian Federation today has more agents of influence than Soviet Union has ever had at its peak. Inside Western Hemisphere, inside European Union, inside NATO. So this is a huge potential that Russia has. So yes, we should do whatever it takes to prevent that war. And NATO's role is to prevent the war, not to fight the war. Our main objective is to prevent the war. When I do my daily job, at the back of my head, I have a hope that my kids will never see the things I plan happening.
Just to add a couple of very particular points. Energy security remains very important. We haven't discussed it yet.
No, maybe just speak into the micro. Yeah.
I'm sure I messed it up. The issue of underwater security, undersea security, for all the links which maintain the grids of a wide variety of different kinds, including energy, including telecommunications and so on. I think that's an increasing preoccupation and increasing possibilities of Russian engagement in various problematic areas. The second is the one that has just been referred to, the intention of the Russians to try and destabilize our democratic political systems in a variety of different ways. There's been a lot of publicity about the approach in the United States of America and the UK and so on. I think less in the case of Poland, but I think those are real issues which are potentially problematic. And the third is the one that the Colonel referred to earlier about destabilizing by borders. The Russians recently published a new map of what they thought are the sea borders within the Baltic Sea region. And one of the people who was associated with our centre has written a very interesting article about this. It's all the provocation, the push to try and deunite our side of the discussion. And that requires us to move very quickly and very firmly to stop those kinds of possibilities. Myself, I'm more of an adventurist, And I'm also in favour of seeing what kind of destabilizations we could be doing in relation to Russia, which we don't do, I think, to the extent that we could, but that's a different question. So I think it's all those kinds of things, and I think most important of all remains the security of our communication systems, energy pipes, telecommunications pipes, and so on, ensuring they're all sustained. Because we all know if there's some kind of IT failure or whatever, it weakens the whole of our economy. And it's the same problem, cyber attacks of various kinds and so on. And developing, I think the best word is resilience. Our resilience against these kind of attacks is, I think, particularly important in the Baltic Sea region.
And usually the answer is it's an all governance, all nation effort to counter such activities from such enemy.
Słychać mnie? Dobrze. Jeszcze odpowiadając na pytanie, które zadał tutaj pan dotyczące zagrożenia bezpieczeństwa naszego województwa, no trzeba byłoby stwierdzić, że ono jest takie same i tożsame z zagrożeniem całej Rzeczpospolitej. W przypadku naszego województwa to, że leżymy na tej zachodniej ścianie, niczego nie zmienia. Proszę pamiętać, że Rosja posiada środki rażenia w obwodzie królewieckim o zasięgu, który praktycznie jest zdolny razić całą Polskę. Mam na myśli tutaj rakiety SS-26 Iskander ze 152 Brygady Rakiet Operacyjno-Taktycznych Szczerniachowska. Mam tutaj na myśli choćby lotnictwo wprowadzane i dalekiego zasięgu, które operuje w rejonie Bałtyku, rosyjskie, bombowce Tu-160, Blackjack, Tu-95. Mam tu na myśli choćby flotę bałtycką, bo czasami lekceważymy tą flotę bałtycką, ale proszę pamiętać, że okręty rakietowe klasy Bujan, które operują na Bałtyku, ale nie muszą operować na Bałtyku. Mogą operować poza Bałtykiem. Zasięg rakiet kalibr wystarczył, żeby flotylla kaspijska, najmniejsza flotylla Federacji Rosyjskiej, uderzyła precyzyjnie na obiekty w Syrii. Dlatego nie muszą być to okręty akurat klasy Bujan z Bałtyku. Także możliwości rażenia i możliwości tutaj zagrożenia ziemi zachodniopomorskiej są bardzo duże. Proszę pamiętać, że w obwodzie królewieckim mamy 336. Białostocką Brygadę Piechoty Morskiej, Bałtyjska, tak nazywa się Białostocka, ale jest Bałtyjska Piechoty Morskiej, która ma możliwości prowadzenia operacji desantowych w rejonie Morza Bałtyckiego. Zawsze mi się tutaj przypominają takie słowa, gdy byłem, jeszcze miałem przyjemność uczestniczyć, gdy doktorat honoris causa tutaj w Polsce otrzymywał profesor Brzeziński. On zawsze wspominał, że tak, mamy piąty, na tym swoim wykładzie inauguracyjnym wspomniał, że mamy punkt 5 Traktatu Waszyngtońskiego, ale przed 5. punktem Traktatu Waszyngtońskiego jest jeszcze 3. punkt. Najpierw sami się brońcie i czekajcie dopiero na naszą pomoc. Te relacje zmieniły się w ostatnich czasach, jeśli chodzi o bezpieczeństwo Polski, ale ja wychodzę z założenia, że najpierw musimy sami dbać o siebie. To, co tutaj wspomnieli przedmówcy i tak bardzo mi się tu podobało. Jako Polska, jako naród leżący w środku Europy, 36-8 milionowy, mamy olbrzymie zagrożenia tych wojen hybrydowych, do których nie jesteśmy przygotowani, nie wiemy jak na nie reagować. Mamy zagrożenia, przyjęliśmy olbrzymią ilość Ukraińców z sercem, otwartą duszą, ale pamiętajmy, że wśród tych Ukraińców jest wielu Rosjan na paszportach ukraińskich, które skradli na Krymie. I my musimy się z tym liczyć. Z tymi właśnie pożarami, niekontrolowanymi działaniami. Musimy być na to przygotowani. W sensie legislacyjnym mamy szereg lekcji do odrobienia jeszcze jako państwo polskie, żeby przed tym się zabezpieczyć. Mamy jeden za to bardzo ważny atut w ręku. Jesteśmy jednolitym państwem. U nas w Polsce, mimo że jesteśmy skłóceni, w zakresie bezpieczeństwa jesteśmy w miarę jednolitym państwem. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję.
dziękuję. So, more comment or an additional statement to our discussion. Thank you. And maybe there are some other questions.
At first, I would let's say great thank you. It was very informative and interesting discussion. Second, one comment, but far from the subject, because I saw your surprised faces by this shouting outside of the window. You had a live coverage of the match Slovakia-Ukraine, and if you counted properly, the Ukraine scored 2 goals and won the match 2-1. And the third is a maybe provocative question, but well, the subject and the name of the discussion is Baltic Sea region. But if we counted these dangers, we're talking about China, about Russia aggression, about energy, about migration. If we put this discussion on the level of Europe, I think that the areas would be the same, or no? What's your opinion about this?
I think the responses would be very different around Europe. It's interesting, the two questions that have just been.
Yeah, I think you switch it off again.
I think the colleague here comes and turns it on, and I then turn it off. That's the way it goes forward. Apologies. I thought it's interesting, the two questions just asked are about security threats that people see here in Pomerania and the particular issues that are here. If you were to ask the same questions in Cadiz, in the south of Spain, or in Porto in Portugal, or in Marseille in France, you just get completely different answers. And I think that it is the case that across NATO, though there is an agreed unity, agreement about Article 5 and so on, I don't think the understanding of the situation here in the Baltic is spread widely across the whole of the European Union, the whole of NATO, in the way that one might think. And I don't think that's surprising, actually, because people are always, as the questions here were doing, going to look to their own security in their own situation and ask what is happening. My answer to your question is I think we have to try and work across generally to try and get a much wider understanding of what the security challenges are. And that's what NATO is doing all the time. Now with the new Secretary General going to come in, we'll see how that goes. But trying all the time to develop that understanding.
The only thing I'd add to that is that the situation in the Baltic Sea region is indeed much more acute than elsewhere. So if you take, for instance, Romania, which is also threatened by the Russian Federation, of course, it's got, on the maritime side, it's open, but at least on the land side, it's covered by Ukraine. But if you look at particularly the 3 Baltic states, but also Poland, which is directly threatened from Kaliningrad Oblast, as we just heard, the 3 Baltic states threatened from the forces that were in Pskov and will now return to Pskov, if they have an opportunity. So that threat level is just much higher than anywhere else in Europe. So it's actually one of the reasons why we established the Baltic Geopolitics program in Cambridge, because we were of the view 3 years ago when we set it up that for all these reasons, the Baltic was going to be the area where the threat would be most keenly felt. And that's what we most needed to understand and to increase levels of understanding within Britain and other NATO countries about that.
So I would argue a little bit. First, I will start with a quote from yet another high-ranked official, military official from Estonia this time. Just recently, he stated something like, where you see smoke, I see fire. And that is something very relevant for, first of all, for the frontline nations, the nations of the flank. But my point is that even though we can here observe different narratives, so it's still around the perspective. Like, the opinion or perspective depends on the point of sitting or from where you observe the phenomenon, but you are still looking at the same phenomenon. So by nature, I think it's just the price tag of globalization. Fast developing world, getting a lot of things more connected, interconnected, interdependent. And I think that our civilization, our societal changes simply do not keep up with those changes. We simply did not comprehend, we did not work out our homeworks or lessons back home how to understand the consequences of globalization.
Yeah, I think so. What you were saying reminded me of the debates from the 1980s, so about all these NATO deployment of new strategic weapons, and so there actually the idea was, so if there's a war zone, it will have global effect, and it doesn't make a difference where you're sitting. So it maybe whether you're in a capital or on the countryside, but not whether you're in, let's say, Western Pomerania or where you're in, let's say, southern Italy. It wouldn't change. Everything would be affected. But what we learned, let's say, from recent war, so of the full-scale aggression, is so that actually the areas matter. So we really have to deal with the regions. But there is, so this is actually what all the others already described well. But I wanted to add two more things. So why the Baltics region, the perspective on the Baltics region is relevant. So the one thing is, let's say, the perspective of the small nations. So, and there's a well-known Estonian saying, so that small nations per se have a larger perspective than the big nations, because they have to look very much what is going outside of them, whereas the big nations don't need to take notice of the small nations around them. So, meaning from the Baltic states, so the perception of what is going on in Russia, so there is definitely more expertise, and maybe not only on the level of the experts, but general of society. So, and this definitely adds to the debates in Europe. So there is an important, let's say, Baltic Sea region contribution to the debates on security in Europe. And the second thing, what we also learned, in particular from the Nordic societies and scholars, is to talk about securitization. So meaning that you reflect why security aspects are added to debates on energy. And if you do this, then you can also discuss, so is it relevant? When does it become relevant? So the security aspects, and meaning that you, let's say, do not talk about security all the time and everywhere, but that you are able to reflect in which case it's relevant and which cases we should then rather talk about, let's say, environmental protection or whatsoever, and not see it, let's say, firsthand as an issue NATO should be concerned with. But of course, if you make such a distinction, then it's quite clear when military security becomes relevant.
Okay, it's on. Okay, I got to ask you a provocative question. I was listening to a Chinese perspective on the whole conflict, and I have to say that the Chinese has a completely different vision of the world. They see the world completely differently as we do, and as you expect, they see NATO as a kind of an American power tool, as a tool of America to exercise power all over Europe. So if that is the case, really, do you think that Europe can become more independent in terms of building its own military power here in Europe to somehow be free of American influence and yet counter Russia? Or do you think that it's really not that possible to be free of American influence in Europe and trade security guarantees for more independence?
So I think some parts of the answer to these questions have already been laid down during this conversation, because we touched a little bit on how China sees what means strength, what means vulnerability. So simply taking this question out of the Chinese debate, bring it here to the, let's say, Western hemisphere, I would say makes much less sense, because behind the question there is always some kind of value, and even behind the answer there's also a value. And apparently our values differ from the Chinese ones. So depending on whom do you ask this question, definitely you'd hear a different answer. Chinese or Asian versus European or American. We could argue how much truth is behind this statement that NATO is just an American setup, because if we, for instance, take it literally, what the first NATO secretary said, Lord Ismay Hastings, when NATO was created, pretty rough statement. NATO is to keep America in Europe, Russia out of Europe, and Germany down. If you follow such narrative, then you might get to really crazy answers. But I think we should deny that kind of thinking and look at it as our values, means or tools to create or to uphold the system that we want to have in place in our hemisphere, in our land. I wouldn't dare to say which perception or approach is better, our or Chinese, because apparently our suits our needs, Chinese suits Chinese needs. And I think it's a wrong, or like a dead end, or at least a very risky ground to say these are right, those are not right. It's simply the means we use in order to achieve objectives, the things we need to live. Like the values that we consider the ones that we want to bring on our flags versus the others. So depending on the perspective, the answer to your question would be really different. But I would disagree with this NATO being a tool in American hands to control Europe. That really is like a very, very old-fashioned, outdated thinking.
Yeah, but still there. So if you look at the West European left, so I think you might find some politicians thinking in a similar way. So, but I think the problem is rather the other way around. So whether, let's say, America under a new Trump presidency would force the Europeans to stand on their own feet in regards of military security.
Or do more.
Yeah. So this might be the real problem.
I would just for a second jump out of my role as the host of the panel and just participate with a short statement. What you mentioned about China seeing things totally differently is also something that is new with this famous bon mot that has been attributed to several Chinese personalities in the Communist Party in the late 60s or early 70s in their contacts with Western politicians when some realpolitik made the West open itself to continental China, so communist China, and not only Taiwan, and it's attributed to Deng Xiaoping. It's attributed to Zhou Enlai during some discussion with French diplomats and some small talks in order to find some subject that could be interesting. French diplomat asked the Chinese, what do they think of the French Revolution? And the answer was, well, I think it's too early to have an opinion about that. The time frame is different. We're speaking about a plan for 2049. We're totally missing the point, because we're living in very quick times in our Western perspective, and they have really long-term plans. They're consequently preparing, and like a bulldozer, no matter what happens. If there are some backlashes, okay, but we go on, and it's a thing that culturally we need to understand also.
I offered my American bosses back then, when I used to work for US CENTCOM, a statement that we in the West lost strategic long-term perspective. And then I got counterattacked. Okay, how can you say so? Explain. And he ordered me to write a paper on this. And I wrote a paper. So basically the thing is that in the West, in today's reality, we look through 3 to 5 years perspective. Why? Because of elections. From elections to elections. And it is a sad truth of the Western world of today, that we are so bound by the politics, domestic politics and elections and whatever political power trying to win the power and rule the country, that we simply forgot how to think cross generations, like long term, just as Chinese do it. So it is a big dilemma right now that we are facing in the West, how to go back, how to relearn about strategic thinking. so that we do not have changes like, complete shifts. Once this party wins, then another party wins, and we are changing everything. And we also face it in military. I also dared to state once to a general when there was a question about what should be our priorities. And we went to discussion, and it came to a point where I said, sir, unfortunately, I never met a general officer who came to the office and stated up front, okay, we will keep on doing. I know it's bad. It might not be better, but just for the sake of continuity and setting the stage for the future, we just continue. Whenever a new commander comes, he always wants to change a lot. Now we are doing this and that just to change and, to shine. And that also is an example how we lost the ability to think strategically long term in the West.
Okay, so this is maybe the greatest challenge, not the easiest one. I would like to thank all of you. First of all, our panelists, Professor Brendana Simmsa, Charles Clarke, Colonel Maciej Zaborowski, Professor Jörg Hackmann, and of course the audience for this very interesting debate. Maybe we have not been able to find so many answers, but I think at least we have managed to put the finger on the hot points that will be important and of relevance in the next coming years, or maybe decades if we enlarge the perspective, as probably we should. Thank you very much, and we wish you a nice evening. And special thanks, of course, to the translators for the great job.